The Lewis and Vought Corporation was formed in New York on the 18th of June 1917. Their office was on the third floor of the five-story Garside building in Astoria, sandwiched between a manufacturer of women's footwear below and a phonographic record company above. Birdseye Lewis committed suicide while serving with the Signal Corps in France in November 1917, leaving Chance Vought as the business's sole proprietor. In the early months of 1918, Vought threw all of his energies into developing the company's first and his seventh aircraft design. He worked long days and nights, and after 91 days, on February the 11th, 1918, the first aircraft was completed. In those days, design and build were part of the same process. Unfortunately, the building lacked an aircraft elevator, aircraft being larger than shoes or records and thus unanticipated in its construction. For this reason, the aircraft were lowered from a window, section by section, and then assembled outdoors on the ground. Since Vought had no airfield, the planes were tied by the tail to a convenient telephone pole and the pre-flight engine runs were performed in the street. Health and safety standards were a little bit more lax in 1918. By mid-March, several VE-7s were shipped to the Airplane Engineering Department at McCook Field, Dayton, Ohio. Common sense and simplicity were key terms used in describing the VE-7. It was the first aircraft to be extensively flight tested and stress analyzed by the US Army and proved to be the most uniform design tested up to that point. Reports commended it highly on mechanical, flight, and maintenance features. Aside from its excellent performance, it was beautiful to behold, with a finish that rivaled the finest automobile and a smart blue trim which resulted in the nickname BLUEBIRD. In May 1918, the VE-7 competed with 7 other planes at McCook Field. It was regarded as the best of the lot, mainly due to its wide speed range and ease of handling. It was thus recommended for immediate procurement, replacing existing training types. The official report stated, in somewhat arcane English, that if the VE-7s were to be used for all training, primary and advanced, a saving of time would result as the student would be capable of at once handling a service-type machine without having to be put through the stepping up process, as is at present the case. Billy Mitchell was particularly fond of it, saying that despite being a trainer, it had all of the air qualities of a single-seater and would outmaneuver the Spad, Newport and the SE-5. Even as a two-seater, it had roughly the same weight and power as the Spad or the SE-5, yet featured a larger wing area. The comparison with the Newport 28 seems a little fanciful, however, given how much lighter that fighter was than the admittedly more solidly built Vought. Because of its agility, consideration was given to buying a single-seat fighter version, but this was abandoned by the Army as they preferred to buy proven European types. Chance Vought was renowned for his meticulous nature in everything, from his engineering to his natty dress sense, and this shone through in the VE-7. It was a well-finished but somewhat conventional 24-foot-long biplane with a 34-foot wingspan that weighed just under 2,000 pounds at takeoff. It generally resembled a de Havilland DH-4 with the nose of a Spad. Initially powered by an American-built Hispano-Suiza A engine with 150 horsepower, later models had 180 horsepower E-series. The choice of engine was obvious from the word go. The Hisso was a good engine in the day, and Vought had had a hand in convincing the French to buy thousands of license-built examples while at the Wright-Martin Company in 1916. Unfortunately for him, the end of the war meant that deliveries to the Army Signal Corps were limited to 14 aircraft. Their production had been delayed because the Hisso engines were sent to upgrade Curtiss Jennies, constraining supply to Vought. Although they arrived in 19, the aircraft was regarded as top secret until 1920 and thus not revealed to the public when an example won the New York to Toronto race. The upshot of this success was an order of 20 aircraft from the US Navy. It was the beginning of a fruitful and long-standing partnership. The Bureau of Construction and Supply requested some changes to the design for naval use. Foremost amongst them was a cage for 2 homing pigeons, I assume because a radio was too heavy rather than as an in-flight snack for the crew. Because of restrictions on the nature of the service, most Navy aircraft were outfitted with floats to make it clear that they were not land-based aircraft. Although the float planes were unarmed scouts, the land-based versions carried a synchronized Vickers machine gun in a forward cowling and a flexible Lewis gun in the rear cockpit for the observer. The Vaught's toughness made it able to accept the heavy forces of a catapult launch off the turret of a battleship. There weren't any US carriers at that time. But as early as May 1919, some progressive commanders in the Navy were seeking to develop more sophisticated aircraft carriers to defend the fleet from air attack and potentially to launch attacks themselves. Because the VE-7 was the hottest thing they had in the early 1920s, it was used in a series of land-based trials to test its short-field takeoff and landing performance. It performed excellently and spurred the conversion of the Collier Jupiter into the USS Langley. In 1921, the VE-7 evolved again. This time the Navy ordered a single-seat fighter powered by the 180 horsepower Hisso. These were designated VE-7S or SF if they were equipped with flotation aids. They were hot aircraft for the US aviators of the day and excellent at aerobatics. While Langley was fitting out at Norfolk, a team of aviators led by Godfrey Chevalier practiced touch-and-go landings on a 100-foot-long wooden platform over a coal barge. At the same time, on the west coast, Navy pilots began training on an 836-foot wooden flight deck, somewhat longer than the Langley's deck, at North Island, San Diego. In 1922, USS Langley was complete. On the 22nd of November, Lieutenant Virgil Griffin climbed into one of the hot VE-7SFs. Langley was anchored in the York River. Because the Vought had no wheel brakes, the only way to get it to maximum power for takeoff was to hold it down on the deck using 5-foot wire attached to a bomb release, which was in turn attached to the landing gear. At the appropriate moment, the release was snapped, and Squash Griffin surged down the short flight deck, beginning to lift off as he passed the Langley single elevator and thus entering the history books as the first US aviator to take off from a full-deck carrier. The VE-7 was regarded as too heavy to use as a test vehicle for landing. After much experimenting with smaller aircraft, the arrestor wires were suitably proven to take the faster, heavier Vought. Sadly, the pioneer of those US carrier landings, Godfrey Chevalier, died on the 14th of November 1922 from injuries suffered in an accident in a VE-7 on the 12th of November. He had barely survived 3 weeks after becoming the first US aviator to land on a moving ship at sea, achieved in an Aeromarine 39. Landing a VE-7 on the Langley was a highly skilled and dangerous activity. For starters, the seats were not adjustable, so it was necessary to carry additional cushions to boost the pilot up in order to see the flight deck on takeoff and approach. A tall pilot might only require 3 cushions, but shorter men needed 4 or 5. Proven after much testing, VF-1 and VF-2 became the first US carrier squadrons, equipped with VE-7s. They were replaced by VE-9s in the mid-1920s, which were essentially VE-7s with a 220 horsepower Wright E4 in the nose. These, in turn, were retired in 1928. The VE-7 was therefore an aircraft of firsts. Vaught's first aircraft as an eponymous concern, the first US aircraft to take off from a carrier, and the first to deploy with an operational squadron at sea. It also launched one of the great partnerships in World War II and Cold War aviation, that of Vought and the US Navy. It was not a revolutionary aircraft, nor was it multitudinous. Only a total of 128 were built, in many variants. But it was a significant turning point in the history of aviation.